David Johnson had always been the pillar of his family, hard-working, strong-willed man who built his life from the ground up. At 73 years old, living in his quiet suburban home in Texas, he never expected his own son, Mark, to call him useless. At a family dinner, Mark, the youngest of his 3 children, had been the one David supported the most throughout his life. But on that fateful evening, in front of the whole family, Mark's disrespect pierced David's heart, though it hurt. Deeply, David chose silence over argument. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he realized something. He had spent his life building a home, providing for his family, and showing them love. Yet they no longer saw him as the man who had made sacrifices for them. He decided that enough was enough. The very next morning, without a word, he took action. He called the locksmith and arranged to change every lock in the house. One by one, he replaced them, securing his space. As he worked, he reflected on his life, his hard-earned legacy, and how it had all been taken for granted. The silence that filled the house now carried a weight he had never known before. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where David would reclaim his dignity and demand the respect he deserved. David Johnson sat quietly in his favorite chair by the window, the soft hum of the evening settling over his suburban home in Texas. At 73, he had never imagined that his family would turn on him. He had spent his life as the provider, the protector, the one who built their home with his own 2 hands. Yet there he was, the victim of his own son's disrespect. Mark, his youngest son, had called him useless in front of the entire family. The words stung, more than David could express, but he kept his emotions in check, chewing his food slowly, as if nothing was wrong. He had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than a heated argument. But inside, his heart ached. That night, David lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. How had it come to this? He had worked tirelessly, sacrificed his own needs to raise his children. And yet, in the eyes of his son, he was now just an obstacle in the way. For the first time in his life, he felt invisible, irrelevant, an afterthought. But David was no ordinary man. He had lived through hardships, had seen life at its toughest, and this was not how his story would end. The next morning, with the first light of dawn creeping through the window, David made a decision. Without a word to anyone, he walked down to his front door, picked up the phone, and called the locksmith. The house he had built, brick by brick, year by year, would no longer be a place where he felt like a stranger. David wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He was determined. The locks were going to change, and so would the way his family saw him when the locksmith arrived. David instructed him to change every single lock in the house front door, back door, garage, everything. There would be no more spare keys, no more taking his house for granted. Each click of the lock was a silent testament to his newfound resolve. His actions spoke louder than any words could. The man who had once been at the mercy of his children's demands was now reclaiming his dignity. As David worked through the morning, he thought about his past. He remembered the long hours spent as a construction worker, the sweat that had soaked his clothes as he laid the foundation for this home. He recalled the nights he spent baking bread, providing for his children even when there wasn't much to give. David had always put their needs before his own. And now, at 73, after a lifetime of sacrifice, he was being treated as if he no longer mattered. When David finished replacing the locks, he sat down in his usual chair, taking a moment to breathe. The house was quiet, eerily quiet. He knew that. Today would mark the beginning of a new chapter. His family would have to learn to respect him again. No more would he be the invisible man who could be pushed aside at will. As the day wore on, his children began to stir. Mark was the first to wake up and see what had happened. When he saw his father kneeling at the door, changing the locks with his own hands, a look of shock crossed his face. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. David looked up at his son, his expression calm but firm. "I'm fixing what's broken," he said quietly, not needing to explain further. Mark stood frozen in the doorway, unsure of what to say. David could see the wheels turning in his son's mind. For the first time in a long while, David wasn't just a father. He was a man to be reckoned with. The rest of the family began to trickle into the room, their faces full of questions. His older children, who had once looked up to him, now seemed unsure. His daughter-in-law stood in the kitchen, a cup of coffee. In her hands, watching the scene unfold, no one said a word. David had already spoken with his actions. When the final lock was replaced, David stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned to face his family. From now on, he said, his voice steady and commanding, "If you want to enter this house, you will ask me. No more spare keys. This is my home, and I will be treated with respect." The room fell silent. Not a soul moved. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time in years, David felt the weight of his authority, the quiet power that came with standing up for himself. As the days passed, the tension in the house didn't subside. His children, who had once walked through the house as if it was theirs to control, now walked on eggshells. There were no more loud arguments or disrespectful remarks. There was only a quiet understanding that David was no longer someone to be dismissed. He had drawn a line in the sand, and his family had to accept it, but David wasn't done yet. He knew that he needed more than just a few changed locks to protect his legacy. He contacted his old lawyer, James, and began the process of ensuring that his house, the one he had built with his own hands, could never be sold or taken from him without his permission. He wasn't just protecting his home, he was protecting his dignity. And if anyone thought they could challenge that, they would soon learn that David Johnson wasn't someone to be underestimated. In the end, David's actions weren't about revenge. They were about reclaiming the respect he had earned over a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. He wasn't going to let his children take what he had built, not without a fight. And if they didn't like it, they could leave. Because David knew one thing for sure. He would rather sleep under the stars than live in a house where he wasn't respected. This was only the beginning of his journey. A new chapter was unfolding, and David was ready for whatever came next. David Johnson had felt the tension building in his home. His children, once so eager to come and go as they pleased, now moved through the house as if walking on eggshells. The change was subtle at first, a shift in the air that David could sense but couldn't quite put into words. They were watching him more closely, tiptoeing around him in a way that felt unfamiliar. For a man who had always been the backbone of his family, it was a strange and unsettling feeling. But deep down, David knew it was a necessary change, a shift that had to happen if he was ever going to reclaim the respect he deserved. The first time Mark, his youngest son, came to him, after the locks had been changed, David had been ready. Mark had stood in front of him, his shoulders slumped, as if expecting David to yell, to berate him. But David hadn't. Instead, he had simply looked at his son and said, "I'm fixing what's broken." There was no anger in his voice, just a calm, steady conviction. Mark hadn't known how to respond, and David had understood that. It wasn't a fight David was after. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He'd already proven himself. In 1,000 ways over the years, what he needed now was to be heard, to be acknowledged. In the days that followed, the silence in the house grew louder. The noise of daily life, once so familiar, had been replaced by a heavy quiet that seemed to settle in every corner. The children, who had once walked through the door without a second thought, now hesitated. The once easy conversations at the dinner table had turned into awkward pauses. David noticed the way they looked at him now, not with the same casual dismissal they had before, but with a sense of caution, as if they were waiting for him to speak, to give them some sign of what was to come next. They had never seen him like this before, calm, composed, and unyielding. David didn't need to say much. He didn't have to. His actions had already spoken louder than any words could. When he had changed the locks, when he had drawn that invisible line in the sand, he had sent a message that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't even just about the keys. It was about the fact that he had finally reached a point where he was no longer willing to accept being treated as if he were invisible, as if he didn't matter. And now his children were beginning to see that. One afternoon, as David sat by the window, sipping his coffee, He couldn't help but think about all that had led him to this moment. He'd spent years building this life, this family, brick by brick. But somewhere along the way, it had all slipped through his fingers. His children had grown up, and in doing so, they had forgotten the man who had given everything to make sure they had the best life possible. And now, at the age of 73, David was facing the harsh truth that the world he had built for them was slipping away. It wasn't that they didn't love him. David knew they did. In their own way, but love had been replaced by convenience, by an unspoken understanding that he would always be there, always willing to give, always willing to sacrifice. And that had to stop. David wasn't looking for a fight, wasn't trying to force his children into submission. What he wanted, what he needed was their respect. Simple as that. He had given them everything, and now he was asking for something in return. And that something was not too much to ask for. It was a fundamental right for any person, especially a father who had done everything he could to provide for his family. He wasn't just asking for respect as an elder. He was asking for respect as a human being, someone who had earned it through years of hard work and sacrifice. The day that David had finally had enough, the day he changed the locks, wasn't just about protecting his home. It was about standing up for himself, for his right to be heard, for his right to be seen. He knew that it wasn't just his children who needed to learn a lesson. It was himself too. For so many years, he had allowed them to take him for granted. He had let their demands go unmet, their disrespect slide. But not anymore. David had realized something. It was never too late to make a stand. It didn't matter how old you were. It didn't matter how much you had given. What mattered was that you knew your worth and you were willing to fight for it. And so, David fought. Not with words, not with anger, but with his quiet, unwavering determination. He had already done the hardest part. He had set the boundaries, taken control, and shown his family that respect was not something they could just take for granted. And now he waited. His children hadn't fully understood it yet. They hadn't fully grasped the magnitude of what had just happened, but they would. David knew that in time, they would come to see that his decision was not just about the house or the keys. It was about something much deeper than need to be respected, not just as a father, but as a person. And that lesson, while difficult, for them to learn, was one that would stick with them forever. As David sat back in his chair, looking out at the familiar streets of his neighborhood, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time in years, David felt at peace. He had done what he had to do. And whatever came next, he would face it with the same quiet strength he had always carried with him. David Johnson sat quietly by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. But in David's mind, it was the calm before the storm. For the past several days, he had been living in a tense, uneasy silence. His children once, so comfortable in his presence, had begun to treat him differently, as though they were tiptoeing around him, uncertain of what might set him off. It was the quiet that made it worse, the way his own home no longer felt like his sanctuary, but a place where he was constantly on edge. Waiting for the next confrontation, David had never been a man who backed down. He had spent his entire life standing up for what he believed in, working tirelessly to provide for his family and create a life they could be proud of. But now at 73, he was facing a different kind of battle, a battle for respect. It was a battle he had been avoiding for years, allowing his children to walk all over him, to take advantage of his kindness and generosity. But now, after Mark, his youngest son, had called him useless, David knew he couldn't remain silent any longer. That evening, after the locksmith had finished replacing the locks on the house, David stood in the hallway, looking at the new, secure doors that separated him from the world outside. He felt a strange sense of peace, like he had finally taken control of something that had been slipping away from him for years. The house was his. And with that small, quiet act, he had set a boundary that would not be crossed. The change was immediate. Mark, still stunned by his father's actions, had become more distant, unsure of how to approach the situation. But David didn't need to say anything more to him. His son's behavior had already spoken volumes. David wasn't asking for much, just a simple acknowledgement of the respect he had earned. It wasn't too much to ask. And yet, for years, it had felt like his children had taken his presence for granted as days passed. David's decision to take action began to weigh heavily on his family. His older children, who had once come and gone as they pleased, now hesitated before entering the house, unsure if they would be welcomed. His daughter-in-law, who had always looked at him with a certain indifference, now stayed out of his way. Even his grandchildren, who had once clung to him with joy, now watched him from a distance, sensing the tension in the air. David could feel the shift. It wasn't just the locks, wasn't even the house. It was the quiet understanding that things had changed. The man who had always been the provider, the one who had never asked for anything in return, had finally drawn a line in the sand. David wasn't angry. In fact, he was at peace. It had taken years for him to get to this point, years of swallowing his pride and enduring the silent pain of being overlooked and dismissed. But now at last he had taken a stand. It wasn't about the locks or the house, it was about the respect he had always given, but had never truly received in return. He had been the rock, the foundation of his family. But now, after all these years, he was finally demanding that his family recognize his worth as David sat there. Watching the cars drive by on the street, he thought about the life he had built. He had worked hard for every inch of it. The house, the yard, the children, everything had been the result of his blood, sweat, and tears. And yet somehow, it had all become something he was no longer a part of. He had become an afterthought, a fixture in the background of their lives. It was a harsh realization, but one that had fueled his decision to take control. No one, not even his children, would be allowed to treat him as if he didn't matter. That morning, as he drank his coffee, David made a decision. He would go one step further. He would go to his lawyer, James, and ensure that everything was in order legally. David wasn't just changing the locks. He was protecting his legacy. He wanted his children to understand that this house's house was not just a building. It was the product of his labor, his sacrifice, and his love. And it wasn't something they could take for granted any longer. The meeting with James was brief, but it was an important one. David signed the necessary documents to ensure that the house was legally protected, that no one could make decisions about it without his permission. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of authority in his hands. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man who had earned his place, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it. When David returned home, he felt a strange sense of clarity. His family didn't know what to make of him anymore. He was no longer the father they could push around or take advantage of. He was still their father. But now he was someone who demanded respect. And though it pained him to see how much his actions had affected them, he knew it was the only way forward. He couldn't continue to live in a house where he wasn't valued. As the days passed, the tension in the house remained. His children, while still uneasy, began to realize that David wasn't going to back down, though they may not have fully understood it yet. They were beginning to see that his demand for respect wasn't just about the house. It was about something deeper, something fundamental. It was about dignity. David was willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. In the end, David knew that he had done what needed to be done. It wasn't just about the house or the locks. It was about standing up for himself for the years of hard work, for the love he had given without expecting anything in return. And now, at last, he was asking for something back: respect. It was a simple request, but one that had taken a lifetime to make, and David Johnson was ready to see it through. David Johnson's life had always been defined by hard work and quiet resilience. His hands, rough from decades of labor, had built the home he had lived in for over 40 years. He had built it with love, sweat, and sacrifice, brick by brick, shaping it into a sanctuary for his family. For most of his life, it had been a place of warmth and laughter, a place where his children could always find refuge. But now, at 73, it had become a battleground for respect. His children had grown, and the way they treated him had shifted. Slowly but surely, until the day mark, his youngest son called him useless. The sting of those words still reverberated in David's mind. It wasn't just the insult, it was the coldness behind it, the complete lack of respect. For years he had put his family first, sacrificing his own needs and desires to ensure they had everything they needed. But now, after all the years of hard work and devotion, he was treated as if he no longer mattered, and that was something David wasn't going to accept. The day he changed the locks in the house wasn't just about securing his home, it was about securing his dignity. It was the quietest act of defiance David could muster. There were no shouts, no dramatic confrontations, just a calm, steady determination to take control of his life again. The moment he replaced the locks, he had drawn a line in the sand. The house, which had once been a place of unquestioned belonging, was now a symbol of his need for respect. He had spent years letting his children take for granted what he had given them. That was going to change. As the days passed, David could feel the tension in the house grow. The silence that followed his actions was not a comfortable one. His children, particularly Mark, seemed unsure of how to approach him. They had always been able to come and go as they pleased, taking advantage of David's generosity and his willingness to accommodate them. But now there was a shift. Mark no longer felt so entitled, and the others began to see that their father wasn't someone they could push around anymore. David wasn't looking for revenge, nor did he want to make his children feel guilty. He wasn't trying to punish them for their behavior. He simply wanted them to understand the weight of his sacrifices, the depth of his love, and the respect he deserved. It wasn't too much to ask. He had given his entire life to provide for them, to make sure they had everything they needed. And all he asked in return was respect. One afternoon, as David sat in his usual spot by the window, he thought about the years that had led him to this point. The house, the family, the memories, everything had been built by him. But somewhere along the way, his children had started to take it all for granted. They had forgotten the man who had made all of this possible, the man who had spent decades working tirelessly to give them a better life. And now they were dismissing him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. The pain of that realization hit David hard, but it also gave him clarity. He wasn't going to stand by and let that happen anymore. It wasn't just about the house. It was about dignity. It was about reclaiming the respect he had earned over a lifetime of sacrifice. David knew that if he didn't take action, his children would continue to treat him as an afterthought, as someone who was no longer relevant. But by taking control, by making his voice heard through his actions, he was sending a message that would not be ignored. The quiet tension continued to build in the house. His children watched him more closely now, and David could feel their unease. They didn't understand why he had done what he had done, but they couldn't deny the message he had sent. This was no longer the same house it had been before. It was no longer a place where they could walk in and out without a second thought. They had to respect the man who had made it all possible, or they couldn't be a part of it. David didn't want to live in an environment where he wasn't respected, where his presence was a mere formality. He wanted his children to understand that respect wasn't something you could demand through words alone. It had to be earned. He'd earned that respect through decades of hard work, sacrifice, and love. And if they didn't recognize that, he was prepared to take further action to protect what was his. The days that followed were filled with quiet reflection. David didn't seek out conversations with his children. He didn't need to explain himself anymore. Silence was his answer. It was enough for his children to see that he wasn't going to back down, that he was standing firm. The respect he had given so freely for so many years had now been turned back on him. He wasn't a burden to be dismissed, nor a relic of the past. He was a man who had earned his place, and he was willing to defend it. As the weeks passed, there were subtle changes. Mark, who had been the most vocal in his dismissal of David, began to approach him differently. He still didn't fully understand why his father had taken the actions he had, but he was beginning to recognize the gravity of the situation. And in that recognition, something changed. Slowly, his siblings, too, began to see that their father wasn't someone they could take for granted. David wasn't asking for much, only the respect he had earned. He didn't need to be celebrated or treated like royalty, just needed his family to acknowledge the sacrifices he had made and the man he had become. And in the quiet, unspoken understanding that was slowly forming in his home, David knew that his stand had been worth it. It wasn't just about the locks. It was about something much deeper: a man's right to be treated with dignity, no matter his age, no matter how much time had passed. It was about family recognizing that respect is something you give, not something you take. And for David Johnson, that realization was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, a chapter where he could stand tall, secure in the knowledge that he had done what he needed to do and had done it on his own terms. David Johnson sat in his old armchair by the window, looking out at the neighborhood that had been his home for decades. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow across the room. It was a peaceful sight, one that used to bring him comfort, but now everything felt different. His children, once so close and full of life, had become strangers. In his own house, the warmth that had once filled the walls now felt cold, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that seemed to grow with each passing day. David had always been a quiet man, the kind of man who let his actions speak louder than words. He had worked tirelessly throughout his life, providing for his family, building a home, and giving everything he had to ensure his children had a better life than he had. But as the years went by, he had begun to notice the subtle shifts. Way his children, particularly his youngest son, Mark, had started treating him like an afterthought. They no longer saw him as the strong, dependable father who had built their lives from the ground up. Instead, they saw him as old, weak, and irrelevant. And when Mark had called him useless in front of the family, David knew that something had to change. The decision had been difficult, but David knew it was necessary. He had spent his entire life taking care of others, sacrificing his own needs for the sake of his family. But now, at the age of 73, he had reached a point where he could no longer ignore the disrespect he had been receiving. It wasn't just about the house or the locks, it was about the dignity he had earned through a lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. It was about reclaiming his right to be treated with respect, something he had given freely to others but had never received in return. When David had changed the locks on the doors, he wasn't just securing his house, he was securing his place in his family's lives. He wasn't going to let anyone, not even his children, walk all over him anymore. He had given them everything. Now it was time for them to give him something in return: respect. It wasn't a lot to ask, but it had become the one thing that seemed to be in short supply. Days passed, and the silence in the house only grew heavier. His children seemed unsure of how to approach him, how to deal with the new dynamic. Mark, who had been the most vocal in his dismissal of David, seemed to have withdrawn completely, unsure of how to face his father after everything that had happened. David didn't expect an apology, nor did he need one. What he needed was for them to understand that he was still a man who had a voice, still someone who deserved to be treated with dignity, no matter his age. One afternoon, David sat in his chair, lost in thought, reflecting on the years that had passed. He thought about how he had worked so hard to provide for his family, how he had given them everything he had, from his time to his energy to his love, and yet here he was, being treated as though he were invisible. The pain of that realization settled in his chest, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. Instead, he found a quiet strength in the knowledge that he had done everything right. He had raised his children to be strong, independent, and capable, but somewhere along the way, they had forgotten the lessons he had taught them. David had spent his life building things: homes, businesses, relationships. But now, he had to rebuild something even more important: his sense of self. I had spent so many years giving to others that he had forgotten how to take care of himself, and now in his final years he had to learn to put himself first. It wasn't an easy lesson, but it was one that David was learning, slowly but surely. He knew that if he didn't stand up for himself now, his children would continue to walk all over him, taking him for granted until there was nothing left. That afternoon, as David watched the cars pass by his window, he made a decision. He would go to his lawyer, James, and have the necessary documents prepared to protect his home. The house, the one he had built with his own two hands, was no longer just a place to live. It was his legacy, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. The legal documents would ensure that his wishes would be respected, that no one, least of all his children, could make decisions about the house without his consent. David wasn't just protecting a physical space. He was protecting his dignity, his right to be treated with respect. He had spent his life giving, and now it was time for him to receive something in return. He wasn't asking for much, just the recognition that he was still a man worthy of respect. The days that followed were filled with quiet anticipation. David didn't confront his children directly, but he could feel the shift in their behavior. They no longer took his presence for granted. They were beginning to understand that he wasn't going to tolerate being treated like an afterthought anymore. But as the weeks passed, David knew that this was only the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments when he would have to stand firm and remind his children of the respect he had earned. In the end, David knew that his decision to take action had been the right one. He wasn't just securing his home or his legacy. He was securing his place in the world. He had spent his entire life giving to others, but now it was time for him to give something to himself. And that something was the respect he had always deserved. David had learned a powerful lesson. It was never too late to stand up for yourself, to reclaim your dignity, and to demand the respect you have earned. And in doing so, he had shown his children that respect is not something that can be taken for granted. It is something that must be earned, and it is something that once lost is not easily regained. David Johnson had spent the better part of his life quietly ensuring that his family had everything they needed. As a young man, he worked long hours in construction, building homes for others, before later turning his hand to baking to make ends meet. His days were long and exhausting, but he never complained. All he ever wanted was to provide for his family, to create a better future for his children than the one he had known. And for decades, it seemed that his efforts had been worthwhile. His home was a sanctuary, a place where his children had grown up, where they had laughed, fought, and built memories. But now, at 73 years old, David sat in his chair by the window, staring out at the street, wondering when it had all gone wrong. His children, who had once looked up to him, had slowly begun to treat him as if he no longer mattered. The small signs had been there for years, the distant glances, the unspoken frustrations, but it wasn't until the moment his youngest son, Mark, had called him useless that David realized the full extent of the distance between them. The words had hurt more than he cared to admit, and they had shaken him to his core. But the more he thought about it, the more he understood that it wasn't just about the insult. It was about the slow erosion of his place in the family. The love and respect he had given freely had been taken for granted, and that David knew was something he could no longer allow. That night as he lay in bed, David made a decision. He wasn't going to argue. He wasn't going to fight. He wasn't interested in petty revenge or a loud confrontation. No, David's plan was quieter, more profound. He would take back control, not by raising his voice, but by asserting his presence. The next morning, he called a locksmith, arranged to have every lock in the house changed, and began the process of securing his space. The house, once a symbol of family unity, had now become a place where respect needed to be earned, not assumed. The change was immediate. David felt a weight lift off his shoulders as the new locks clicked into place. The house felt different, as though it were finally his again, a space where his rules would be respected. When his children arrived and saw what had happened, they were stunned. It was as if David had suddenly transformed before their eyes. The man who had always been the silent provider, the one who had never asked for much, was now standing firm. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling, wasn't even demanding an apology. It simply drawn a line in the sand. Mark, still unsure of how to react, was the first to speak. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice faltering. David, calm and steady, looked up at him. "I'm fixing what's broken," he replied quietly. And with that, Mark had no more words to offer. His father's actions spoke louder than any explanation could. It was clear now things were different. David had reclaimed his dignity, not through force, but through his quiet, unyielding resolve. The rest of the family took notice, though. No one said much. The silence that followed David's actions was deafening. No one knew how to respond, least of all his children. David didn't want to make them feel guilty, but he needed them to understand that respect, just like love, is earned. And while it hurt him deeply to be treated this way after all he had done for them, He knew he couldn't continue to live in a house where he was treated as insignificant. As the days wore on, David didn't have to say much. His family could feel the change in the air. Mark, who had been the most vocal about dismissing him, had become quieter, more withdrawn. The children, who had once been comfortable in their father's home, now hesitated before entering. They were uncertain of where they stood, and for the first time, David felt like he had regained some of his power. He wasn't interested in forcing them to love or respect him. He simply wanted them to recognize that he deserved it. And that was what he had fought for. David wasn't looking for confrontation. He had already won the battle. By changing the locks, by setting boundaries, he had reminded his children of something important, that respect doesn't come automatically. It is something that must be nurtured and earned. His children hadn't understood it for so long, but David knew they would eventually. They had to. One afternoon, David sat by the window again, lost in thought, as his children went about their day. The house felt different now, quieter, yes, but also more peaceful. For the first time in a long time, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had done what he needed to do. He had taken control of his life, not through confrontation or anger, but by asserting his right to be treated with dignity.
The small,
quiet act of changing the locks had sent a message that would not soon be forgotten in the days that followed. The family began to change too. Mark, who had once seen his father as weak and dispensable, began to see him in a new light. The children, though still uncertain, started to understand that their father was not someone to be taken for granted. And David, though he didn't ask for it, began to feel a newfound respect in his home, respect that had been hard-won, but one he knew was deserved. David Johnson had always been a man of action. He had built a home, a family, and a legacy. But now, in his later years, he had built something even more important, his own sense of self-respect. He had shown his children that no matter how old you are, no matter how much you've given, you are never too old to stand up for yourself. And that lesson, though difficult, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. David Johnson had spent his life built homes, he built businesses, and above all, he built a family. For decades, his hands had labored in service of others, providing not just a roof over their heads, but a foundation of love, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment. Yet as he sat in his favorite armchair, watching the world outside his window, David realized something profound had been lost. His children, once so close, had drifted away, drifting further with each passing year, until the day his youngest son, Mark, had called him useless. That moment, more than any other, had been the wake-up call David needed. The quiet strength he had lived with all these years had been overlooked, misunderstood, and ultimately taken for granted. But David wasn't a man who would let his dignity slip away without a fight. He'd always taught his children the importance of respect, of both giving and receiving it. And now, at 73, after a lifetime of sacrifices, he knew it was time to reclaim what was rightfully his. Not just the house he had built with his own hands, but the respect he had earned through decades of hard work. His children needed to learn, just as he had learned, that respect is not something you can demand, it's something you must earn. And David was prepared to do just that, in the quietest, most profound way he knew how, by taking action. When David had changed the locks on the house, he hadn't done it out of spite. He hadn't done it to punish his children. He did it because, for the first time in his life, he realized he had been allowing them to take him for granted. The act of changing the locks wasn't just a physical act of securing his home, it was a symbolic gesture of reclaiming his life, his space, and his dignity. The moment he turned that key, he had made a statement. This was his house, built by his hands, and it was time for his children to show him the respect he had always given them. The silence that followed was deafening. His children, who had once come and gone without a second thought, now hesitated before entering. The tension in the air was palpable. David could feel the shift. Mark, the son who had been the most vocal in dismissing him, now found himself unsure of how to approach his father. For the first time in years, David had taken control not by demanding it, but by quietly asserting it. The message had been received loud and clear. The rules had changed. David didn't seek an apology, nor did he expect his children to understand right away. This was about something much deeper than simple family disagreements. It was about a lifetime of sacrifices, of teaching his children how to work hard and earn what they wanted. It was about showing them that no matter how old you get, you are still entitled to respect. You are still a person who has lived a life worth honoring. And as he sat in that chair, watching the world go by, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't just the locks on the doors or the legal documents that protected his house. It was the understanding that he had done the right thing, that he had taught his children a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. He had stood up for himself, something he hadn't done in years. He had shown them that respect, like trust, had to be earned. David didn't know what the future held, didn't know if his children would ever fully understand the depth of his actions. But what he did know was this: he had reclaimed his power, his dignity, and his respect. And that was something no one could take away from him. It was a victory that would last far beyond the physical changes he had made. It would last in the hearts and minds of his family. And for David, that was enough. In life, we often give so much of ourselves to others, but we must never forget to give ourselves the respect we deserve. No matter how old we are, no matter how much we've sacrificed, we must stand up for ourselves. We are all worthy of being treated with dignity, and it's never too late to remind others and ourselves of that truth. Respect is earned, not given freely. Never let anyone diminish your worth. Always stand tall and be proud of the person you are and the life you've lived. If this story resonated with you, if you understand the power of standing up for yourself, don't forget to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, share your story. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, power, and remind us all of the importance of respect. Together, let's create a community that values hard work, integrity, and dignity. For watching, and remember you're never too old to stand your ground.